And then I always like to put a little Otis Redding on as kind of like intro music, because he has this lovely song called Security. Let me just get past the advertisement. All right, and then share that screen. Share is...
Always like sitting at the dock of the bay. It's always a good one.
Yep, no, that one's classic.
Yep.
And if I share screen, where's the dialog box? Here it is. Otis Redding, share sound. All right, here we go. Let's rewind to the beginning. So it's instantly recognizable when you hear the verse, the first verse.
I want security, yeah. Without it, I'm at a great loss. Oh, now, security.
And of course, he's talking about a relationship, you know, but computers are a relationship as well, right? We spend a lot of time with them. So I can phase that out, and I can stop the share and go to my presentation and get ready.
Great way to start an event. Thank you.
Sure. Let's see, drive, new cybersecurity regulations, slideshow. Pull up my speaker notes. And back to Zoom, share. Look at all the people we got showing up. This is great. Welcome, everyone. We're just about to get started. And I think I'm ready. Let me just make sure that the speaker notes are foregrounded. And you don't have to worry about taking screenshots or notes because I will give you a copy of the slides, which includes the speaker notes and all of the hyperlinks and references that I'll be making reference to, because there's a lot of continued further reading needed for this topic. So welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Wilkes. I am the Director of Cyber Operations for the Security Agency. And behind me, you see a hopeful picture of snowfall this weekend in New York. We haven't had more than an inch of New York in like 600, 700 days. So we're in a bit of a drought. And so I keep trying to invoke the gods of snow or the goddesses of snow to bring us some snowfall so that my kids, can have some snowball fights and make a snow person, snowman, snowwoman. But before I get started, though, let me ask Juan to introduce himself as well, because he's with the security agency, and I want you all to know that you can talk with him, reach out to him afterwards if you have questions as well.
Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. My name is Juan Viguera. I'm based in Bellevue, Washington, outside Seattle, and TSA was built to help all of you become much more secure in your environments. And I hope through the vCISO program that we have put together, we can help our customers and partners become more resilient. Thanks, Mike. That's all I need to say for now. I have a few questions for you later.
Okay, great. So the security agency is a brand new organization, and we are giving birth to it by doing some, public good webinars. And so we have a series of them. This is the second in that series, but we have more planned, once or twice a month, just to share information and build community and outreach and explain, some of our best practices and perspectives on protecting organizations from harm. And one of those sources of harm is regulatory, oversight. You can get fined, right? You can have complaints, you can be sued by the Security Exchange Commission, as SolarWinds has learned. And as a CISO, you can become the first person to ever receive a Wells notice, right? And so that's something I want to dive into a little bit today. So let's see, how many folks do we have on the call right now? 22. So we had about, I think, 60 or 70 registrants. So if you're not here now live, that's okay. You'll be able to watch it. We'll post the recording later. But you won't be able to ask questions, obviously. And I want this to be interactive, so I'm going to try to get through my slides pretty quickly. But if you do have a question during the presentation, feel free to speak up, come off mute. This is a two-way street, right? This is not just Professor Mike Wilkes, who actually does teach at NYU. But anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about myself before we dive into the content. And if you're wondering about this background image, I like to give image credits. This is playgroundai.com with the prompt, empty courtroom scene at sunset with green glass windows, brass lamps, and dark wood paneled walls. And so I think of this as like the day after your day in court, right? Or the evening after, you've been fined or sanctioned, for violating various rules and regulations, of which many of them have changed in the last 6 to 12 months. So if you don't know me, here's my sort of logo slide, and it changes depending on the audience, but I am a security professional that's been doing infrastructure for 30 years. Some of the things I've done, I wrote a book for Cisco Press back in 2002 for a certification that no longer exists, Cisco Internet Solution Specialist, it was called. So that was a great fun 584-page book. It took a little bit of Glenlivet for me to finish writing it in order to challenge myself, at night while I was working on the chapters. I had a little dram of whiskey to keep me going. But it's a great book even to this day in my mind. Certainly one reason is because the certification doesn't exist anymore, but the applied solutions sections that I wrote for each chapter are still evergreen in my mind. And it was a great honor, of course, to be headhunted to write that book from Cisco. So I've been, considered an expert, I guess, for many years. I gave Starbucks its first website. I ran the team in San Francisco during the .com in 1998 that launched Starbucks.com. I gave birth to PlayStation.com for the PS2. I've also, run the DevOps team that launched, Macy's, Blockbuster, all sorts of web properties. And let's see, I moved to Europe after surviving 5 rounds of layoffs during the bubble burst. I was one of the last people standing at Organic Online in San Francisco. And I moved to Europe and I worked on infrastructure there. I built and designed Rabobank's direct banks for Ireland, the UK, Netherlands, Belgium, Australia, and New Zealand. I also built infrastructure for KLM, built the DR infrastructure, ran the team that built ING's DR infrastructure. The Nederlandse Bank kind of put a gun to their head and said, you have one data center and it's below sea level. Solve the problem. And so we were brought in to build a second data center for them. And that was not an easy situation because the client, so to speak, was a hostile entity that was being forced to do something. But we eventually befriended them, which involved, smoking some cigarettes on breaks, hand-rolled drum tobacco with the individual contributors and engineers to win their trust and respect. Then I moved back to the US in 2013 and ran the Chicago Mercantile Exchange enterprise server platform, 10,000 servers, $250 in contracts traded. Again, mostly infrastructure background. I only started doing InfoSec and security for the last 6 or 7 years. So one of my first CISO jobs was actually Marvel. And this is one people love to hear stories about, of course. Because when you're in charge of Marvel security, you're in charge of keeping Iron Man safe, right? And that's my tagline. You may have heard it before if you've heard me speak or watched me present. I'm an academic as well. I teach cybersecurity at NYU. But Marvel was great fun. I was the head of DevOps, enterprise architecture, and InfoSec. And I can tell stories about that as I give anecdotes, for why some of these regulations are important and good best practices. Then after Marvel, I've also worked in financial services for a hedge fund, ran the infrastructure, and was the CISO for Security Scorecard. If you're familiar with their security ratings, I'm still an advisor there. I love to evangelize Security Scorecard and security ratings for continuous monitoring, outside-in discovery of risk that you may not be aware of, because we Nmap and scan all of IPv4 every week. And I just read recently about a partnership today, I think, that was announced with the Canadian Cybersecurity Agency, the equivalent of their NSA. So I think more and more people are starting to pay attention to security ratings and objective quantification of risk. What else? I can also mention that I've spoken at different conferences, Gartner, SANS, Black Hat, GovWare in Singapore. And I'm a member of the World Economic Forum in the Quantum Security Working Group and the Oil and Gas Working Group on Cyber Resilience. So we've published white papers, case studies, toolkits to help people get ready for the day when someone builds a quantum computer that can break RSA encryption. What do we do then? AQR Capital ran a hedge fund infrastructure there for a while. And if you've ever seen the TV show Billions, that is not fiction. That is exactly what it's like to work in a hedge fund. Lots of tempestuous type A personalities going on. And it can be quite fun, but a little bit draining. I've also been a fractional CISO for a healthcare startup in California called Lark, where I'm helping build out a mobile virtual coaching app for diabetes prevention, and of course most recently the security agency, where we're building this practice that we all want you to learn more about. But enough about me. Let me jump into the agenda. Nope, didn't come. All right, so why are you here? Well, hopefully you want to learn about the new cybersecurity regulations, and there are a lot of them. And so think of this as pre-chewed food. Think of this as too long, did not read. What do I need to know? So I've given this presentation already. This is version 2. I've improved it a bit with some of the new regulations that came out from the FCC recently and some other examples. So I want to talk about the SEC disclosure rules, which have had a lot of press. But really it's useful to make sure that everyone's aware of some of the details. The Federal Trade Commission has amendments to their safeguard rules. NYDFS, which I think is one of the best regulatory entities, they're very much a bellwether in my mind, meaning stuff they were doing in 2017, the rest of the regulators are just starting to figure out now. So that's like 6-7 years ago, right? So whatever they're doing now, you can expect to reach other jurisdictions and requirements later, right? Maybe a couple of years in the future. The FCC woke up after 16 years of Rumpelstiltskin sleeping and said, hey, we're in this game too. And so they actually updated their requirements and rules for disclosure after 16 years of no changes. What happened 16 years ago? The iPhone came out 16 years ago. And so that's how long ago they last touched their requirements. And then I'll talk a little bit about DORA, which is the European Union's financial services sector. But you have a lot more time to get ready for DORA. So let's see, social media, lots of useful links in the slides. Like I said, don't need to worry about taking screenshots. I'll give you the actual PowerPoint with the speaker notes and the hyperlinks. So let's jump in. SEC disclosures, the what? All right, so we have these proposed rules, came out a long time ago, March 2022. Comments period closed pretty quickly after that in May. Press release came out in July saying, hey, we're ready to go. As soon as it's published in the Federal Register, all the clocks start ticking. Federal Register publication was August 4th. The final rules are now in effect for Form 10Ks as of December 15th, and final rules for Form 8Ks as of December 18th. So if you're not a publicly traded company, you might think, oh, I don't have to adhere to this. I don't have to worry about this. But no, that's not true. Why? Because of third-party risk. If you do business and support any of these 12,000 SEC publicly traded entities, you may well have to participate in a disclosure. And the big deal, of course, it's a 4-day disclosure rule once you determine a particular incident or event is material. The definition of materiality has been intentionally left vague. I'll talk about that in a minute. But there's basically a new section of the Form 8K, which is section 1.05. And I think it's going to drive a lot of business to a company called Workiva. Workiva is one of those incumbent vendors that helps people produce PDFs that you submit to the SEC. Typically, that's mostly for your financial statements. What was the earnings? What was the profits? How many shares are there? Have there been changes in the leadership? And they use something called inline XBRL in order to tag these documents with meaningful, quantifiable, aggregated metrics. Now that's all possible because you have something called GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. Unfortunately, we don't have the cyber equivalent. We don't have GASP, generally accepted security principles. We have over 473 certifications in our field, most of which I think are useless, but I'll talk about that later. And so it's difficult, actually, for people to harmonize around these new requirements. And the SEC has a good intent, but I do think that their execution is being criticized in different directions as to whether they're actually improving the market's awareness of risk. And that's sort of their goal. Anyway, so I have a link to the final rule. I did a session on this pretty much the first week it was announced back in, I think, July. A separate webinar talking about this and musing over what it's going to do to people's security programs. But basically, the Form 10K has to include a statement of your cybersecurity practice. And it doesn't have to include a lot of detail because they don't want to give away how to breach and attack you to the threat actors. But you do have to sort of say, this is our process, this is how we identify risk, this is how we assess the risk, and this is how we mitigate the risk. And again, it's all high level kind of chat GPT level verbiage. And I actually created a Form 10K that you can download that is the output of a chat GPT prompt. I wrote a LinkedIn post that said, there, I fixed it for you. Thank me later or give me a tip jar right on Patreon or something. All of you 12,000 organizations, because you're all going to have to publish some vacuous statement that contains all the necessary words, which is what LLMs are good for. But it's not going to really say anything meaningful about your security practice. But the SEC will use it to determine whether you're following that policy, should you be a part of a breach and disclose with your Form 8K. What else? Next up, the Form 10K. So like I said, on a lark, I thought it'd be fun to save everyone the trouble. And so I posted this, like 4 months ago or so, maybe longer. Necessarily vacuous, initial 10K, and I just shared it as a Word document. My chat GPT prompt for this was, assume the persona of a conservative lawyer. And if you've ever played around with these large language models, they get really, really good if you tell it to pretend that you are a particular type of person. Otherwise, it comes up with hallucinations and bizarre kind of untrue kind of output. But if you do say, like, assume that you're a mathematics professor, it suddenly does math really well. It won't say 2 + 2 is equal to 5, but it might in other circumstances. So anyway, my prompt was, assume the persona of a conservative lawyer and write an SEC Form 10K statement about the risk management and cybersecurity program for a typical publicly traded company. So I have the link to that in here. I'll share it real time in the chat so that you don't have to wait for the recording or ask for a copy of the deck later. But I do, like I said, encourage you to take this down, mull it over, echo some of this back with your teams. And then checking the chat, let's see, what do we have? Lots of people saying things. Let's see, come to the US Midwest. The fun started here. Feel free to connect with me from Durcia Hernandez, Matt Webster. Oh, okay, so you're just cross-connecting all of you. That's awesome. Excellent. I encourage that. We're all in this together. And then let's see, Phil. Hey, Phil. Additionally, the SEC has jurisdiction over any U.S. entity that accepts funds from investors. We'll see whether not and how they intend to enforce that. Yeah. As soon as you go to like third or fourth party risk, you're talking almost like anyone that's in the space, doing anything interesting for cybersecurity investigations or whatnot. So anyway, this was the piece, and it garnered a fair amount of engagement. Meaning, if you see here, I had like 3,755 impressions on this little post. And like I said, it was just a lark, but I thought it'd be fun to sort of beat people to the punch, because I figured everyone would be jumping onto ChatGPT to generate their Form 10K statements and disclosures and statement process. Next up, small companies. So there's an additional 270 days involved, which means June 15th of this year is when small companies have to adhere to this. And they amended the definition of a small reporting company to include registrants with a public float of less than 250 million, and with registrants with the SEC with annual revenues of less than 100 million from the previous year, and either no public float or a public float of less than 700 million. So this is a link again to the security rules. But basically, all of these companies need to be ready to determine what's material and publish within 4 days of that determination. Now, what's interesting, of course, is you could just sort of chain together a series of Form 8Ks and say, I don't know too much yet, but I want to comply. So here's my post. Because you may not have gotten very far with your incident response and your investigation.
Fascinating what you said, because AI and AI models and what's going on in the United States is so prevalent. Everybody talks about it.
Yeah.
And, you know, the big thing for us is, they're still learning what is regulation. They must push regulation of government. They can't do things now, but they're trying to push the U.S. government to come up with some standardization. There are some states that are even trying to outlaw it. It's not going to happen.
Yep, definitely. Thanks for those comments. Getting the SEC into a position to be able to enforce.
Go the same route.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, who was that?
For me, the problem is not an outlawing, because you may outlaw technology, but not the product of it. Right. So if you just export the content creation, have the content created somewhere where it's legal.
I think Bob needs to go on mute. Is it Bob Anderson? That's the only one which is popping for me. So
okay, no, I think I I see Juan is off mute and Nitin as well, but I think what I'll do is I'll continue with the description, because that may have not been an intentional sharing of audio. So yeah, small companies are going to have to hit this. They just have extra time. But for everyone else, it's already in effect. And I published a winner chicken dinner post, which was VF Corporation. So they're the first one that filed 1.05 Form 8K for their breach. And I don't know if that's infamous, or notorious kind of win, but they're the first ones that actually complied with this. I'm not sure how many there have been since then, but I do have a couple of places to search in order to find, who's doing the disclosures and what they're saying in those disclosures, so that we can analyze them. And then eventually these tags have to be added, and I'll get into the difficulty of that. Like I said, because how do you quantify and tag? I mean, you can say, GM, for example, said that, was it not GM? MGM said that they are going to pay out like $100 million. So that's a tag that you could add. And then the industry and aggregators of breach impacts could take that number and scrape it from these SEC filings using the inline XBRL to produce industry overviews and knowledge. And that's the intent, is to make it easier to mine this data for trends and patterns. But if in the year 2022, there were only 32 SEC disclosures, or 35, might be on a future slide, where people actually declared a material cyber incident. Now, if we know that 80% of companies have been breached or their third party has been breached, which means 2024, I'm expecting there to be at least 10, 12,000 SEC filings that will have to be submitted for publicly traded companies, because there's 12,000 organizations. And if we figure 80, 90% of them are going to have some type of breach event, that it'll be material this year, that's going to go way up. Edgar is going to have a lot more filings. It may even fall over, who knows. But anyway, so this is the definition of smaller company. Next up, materiality. So materiality was intentionally vague, but it needs to include, when you disclose, the nature of the incident, the scope of the incident, the timing, the financial impact, and the operational impact. And so that's going to be interesting, because like I said, the very first precedent-setting disclosures under this new requirement reporting rule, what if MGM had, this was October, so it was just before the requirement came into play, but they did disclose some of this information. They have said approximately $100 million to their adjusted property EBITDA for the Las Vegas Strip resorts and regional operations. Like I said, the intent is to make it easier for investors and advisors, and the definition of materiality hangs off of this fundamental, would it be important for the average investor to know about this? So it doesn't have to be like a financial threshold. It could just be something that affects their decision to invest, not invest, to buy a company, to sell a company, in terms of mergers and acquisitions, and spinning off, assets. And so I put in a link in the chat to, what is the SEC's definition of, using XBRL? Because you can see these things are highlighted in here, right? These are the tags. This one had 22 facts. And again, it's really easy to say, okay, you're a Delaware corporation. This is your address. This is your date. This is your phone number. But when you talk about the bullets on the left, we don't even have a good definition of mean time to response, right? If you look at this as an industry in definition, is it when you act the fact that you saw an alert, or is it when you've responded to the alert and contained the alert? So even one of our fundamental metrics, MTTR, is open to huge interpretation. And so are you going to be, disclosing, after containment? And that's, I think, one of the interesting questions we'll get into in just a second. But anyway, so December 18, 2024 is when the tags have to show up. And so think about that. And in my mind, I think it's useful to think about what are the current disclosures looking like and how are you going to tag this stuff? Because scope, like how do you tag the scope of a ransomware attack to make it a quantifiable thing highlighted in red here on the disclosure? I don't think that's going to be as easy as everyone was hoping, at the SEC. Next up, Federal Trade Commission. So while everyone was paying attention to the SolarWinds case against Tim Brown, the FTC just kind of silently slipped in their updates on October 27th. And they have a lot bigger remit than the SEC, right? The Federal Trade Commission affects lots and lots of entities, not just 12,000 financial services firms that are publicly traded. And so they said that they now require institutions to notify the FTC as soon as possible and no later than 30 days after discovery of a security breach involving at least 500 consumers. That's a pretty low bar. If you look at the US 56 states and territories, because you need to pay attention to other things, not just 50 US states. And each one has a different reporting threshold. I think Texas is like 10,000 Texans. California, if I remember correctly, it's like 5,000 California residents have to be involved in a breach before you have to disclose to the Attorney General. And then they have a website where you can go and look at all the people that are disclosing their breaches that involve California citizens and data. And then, of course, how soon is a variable as well. So sometimes it's, 24 hours, sometimes it's as soon as possible. Some states say, within 10, working days. Other ones, have really bizarre, like 30 days requirements. So it's pretty lax. But most of those are in flux and changing. And so effective May 13th is when this Federal Register change of rules for the FTC comes into effect. So that's called the Safeguards Rule. And again, this is nothing terribly onerous. But if you don't know this and you do have an event and your legal team and your outside counsel don't know that you have to also notify the FTC, then you could get in trouble, of course, with them. And so I put in a link to the Federal Register documents here as well. What else about the Safeguards Rule? The FTC staff is smoking crack in my mind, right? Because they did an estimate and they anticipated the affected financial institutions and attorneys involved. And they calculated as like 2 hours of burden to produce one of these reports. And they said the median, whatever research they did, they said the mean hourly wage for a lawyer is $78.74. I'm like, not in New York, and certainly not in most other states that I'm aware of. Because they think, okay, it's going to cost you $157 to produce a filing with the FTC. And they expect, total labor costs, $330, rounded to the nearest dollar. And they think maybe 115 institutions a year are going to get breached. I'm like, what? Are you not aware of how often breaches are happening? The whole point of disclosure is to make it more available and visible for us so that we can collectively, as defenders of critical infrastructure, whether it's financial services or not, do a better job of it, right? So the more awareness we have, ostensibly, the better protected we'll be, because we'll know what were the tactics, techniques, and procedures that got through to MGM, right? Which was like social engineering, a little bit of Active Directory, lateral movement, and boom, all of your shit is encrypted, and you're, $100 million, out the door. They paid ransom, right? It was Caesars that didn't pay. Oh no, sorry, Caesars paid the ransom. And I think they did a better job of it, I guess, right? Because they were probably if I remember correctly, Caesars was asked to pay 30 million, and you bring in a negotiator, and it usually comes down to about half that number. So let's say they paid $15 million to get themselves out from underneath this ransomware attack by the same threat actors. But MGM decided not to pay, and so now they have to recover and rebuild, and of course probably fire their CISO. Right? But anyways, one of the things here was that, like I said, I think the average hourly rate for a lawyer across all U.S. states, according to my research on lawpay.com, was more like $261 to $269 an hour, and even in New York, it's going to be way higher because we're outliers, in that area. But anyway, so that's a little bit about FTC. NYDFS, though, this is, like I said, my favorite regulator, favorite updates, favorite improvements that others will follow soon enough. And so we've got Part 500, and it was amended to say several things. But basically, entities have about 180 days from the date of adoption. That means April 29th, 2024. Some of the things actually came into effect as of December 1st, actually, which was 1 month after publication of the requirements. And other ones are going to be phased in up to a year or 18 months later. So that little bit of complexity aside, there's a really good YouTube video that was published of these guidance. And basically, they did 3 of these sessions. I'll put it in the chat. And the one I attended had 1,000 participants, right? And it reached sort of like that WebEx cap, right, for a webinar. So we didn't get to ask questions like in this call and speak, but it was a really good overview. But I'm trying to digest it for you now so that you don't necessarily have to go watch that video. But I put a link to it in the chat, and it's in the slide notes. But anyway, so I attended the one on November 30th. The recording is from December 7th, and just lots of really good information about what are the changes that came. There's a copy of the deck as well, which includes details of the changes. But let me give you the lowdown. Basically, there's 4 interesting things. 1, MFA for everyone. So it's no longer just for privileged user accounts. As of November 1st, 2024, all users for all 3,000 covered entities of NYDFS have to have MFA for everyone. CISA has been on this bandwagon for a while, and I don't know any CISO that doesn't want to have MFA everywhere. But getting to that point can be difficult depending on how much legacy infrastructure you have. A lot of things are not open to multi-factor auth, so you may have to re-architect or re-engineer. But I do think this is a great mitigation. But let's not forget, MFA can be bypassed. It is not a silver bullet, but it will get you out of jail for around 90% of the kinds of attacks that go after business email compromise and user account takeovers. So it's a really good mitigation. So no one would argue that, oh, this is impossible. We can't do MFA for everyone. It's like, sure you can. And you don't have to pay a lot of money for it. You don't have to go to Okta. You don't have to go to Ping. You don't have to go to all of these identity providers to do this. You can use Google Authenticator for free. You can do it on SSH. You can do it on web apps. You don't have to pay, and we can help explain how to implement MFA for everyone if you'd like, or if you need help in that direction. Ransomware disclosure. So there is now a 72-hour reporting requirement that began December 1st if you detect ransomware on your infrastructure. That doesn't mean you've remediated it. It just means you've detected it. You have to tell them within 72 hours. And then the other piece is more interesting in my mind. If you pay a ransom, you have a 24-hour reporting requirement for payment of ransom. So that level of transparency is going to bring a whole bunch more awareness. Because right now, everyone wants to know, everyone goes to the dark web or pays someone else to go to the dark web for them and say, oh, look, this is, what was the breach du jour recently? I don't know, we could talk about VRF Corporation. They're going to post on the dark web the ransomware payment link and the details of how to be contacted. And it's possible through threat intelligence and dark web monitoring to know that that link went up. When the link goes down before the date, they paid, right? So it's a quasi-observable event, right? With a little bit of help to know whether someone paid the ransom. And so now the NYDFS can potentially go after people and say, hey, we saw your ransomware page go up on the dark web, and then we saw it go down before the deadline. So it looks like you paid. But if you didn't report it to us in 24 hours, we're going to come and investigate you. Number 3, risk assessments. These need to be performed at least annually. So before it was just a good idea. It was guidance. It's like, hey, you should probably have someone come in and do a risk assessment once a year. Now it's required. And they added an extra bit. Whenever you make a material business technology stack change, aka you move from like on-prem to the cloud, or you introduce a brand new database technology or some other type of API service or something, any drastic material business change requires another risk assessment. And again, that's just best practice. Most large organizations are doing this anyway, right? If you go from version 2.0 to version 3.0 of some huge thing that you do, I don't know if it's an example would be, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, right? Or the Chicago Board of Trade, or a hedge fund. If you make some major technology shift, you probably want to come in and do an independent risk assessment of it. And you want to follow a framework, and you want to publish, the fact that you did the assessment. You have to ticket all of the findings. You have to remediate the findings. Why? Because your auditors are going to come in and ask you for these artifacts. And so now everyone's going to have to do risk assessments. And guess what? The security agency, we're in the business of doing risk assessments. We can do CIS top controls. We can do NIST 800-171. We can do, what are some of the other ones? NIST CSF, if that's your framework. Anything that you might want to do should be done by a third party. You can do internal risk assessments as well. Yeah, Darcy, your question was, is this independent or in-house? This is third party external. Why? Because it's generally more objective. If you do an internal risk assessment, that's great. You may be looking at stuff and your team might say, oh, we shouldn't touch like this particularly fragile piece of legacy infrastructure. And they may have an unconscious bias against pen testing that thing. But the third parties aren't going to have that bias generally. And so they are going to come at it and come up with novel, attacks that you might not have thought of that would make the service fall over or compromise it. And then the last one is my favorite, 2 signatures. I always imagine when I heard about this, when I read about it, one of those prison escape scenes in movie, right? Where the 2 prisoners are running across like a farm field and they're shackled at the ankle together. So they have to kind of run like a 3-legged race. And I think it's fun to think, and beautiful actually, because CISOs can't be thrown under the bus alone for a breach event. Or for non-compliance, in the SEC case with Tim Brown and SolarWinds. You now have to have the highest ranking executive and the CISO sign off. And the first sign off is April 15th of this year. And it's for all of calendar year 2023. So there's no way that you could have injected all of these new controls on like December 29th or something, right before the end of the year. And it has to apply to the whole calendar year anyway. So there was no impetus to sort of last minute ditch effort, raise the bar on some of your security, aka MFA for everyone, risk assessments. So this is basically going to be an interesting point. If there's 3,000 entities, what's your guess? How many of those 3,000 are going to say, hey, we actually do all this stuff. We're compliant. And then CISO signs, highest ranking executive officer signs. So I'm thinking it's going to be less than half that are going to say, yeah, we're good with this. Because that's going to be held against them, of course, if they get breached and then the investigation reveals they didn't have MFA for everyone, they didn't do risk assessments, that kind of thing. So I think this is a really useful element of the DFS changes. And then now FCC. So this is my Rumpelstiltskin joke, right? First update to their requirements in 16 years. So they're updating the definition of a breach. Well, yeah, I would presume that needs a little bit of dusting off. They've updated, of course, the relevancy for telcos, carriers, and providers. And they're requiring FCC notification no later than 7 business days after a reasonable determination of a breach and 30 days for customer notification. Now, oddly enough, their regulation prior to this update, they put in an intentional delay period for customer notification. So they're rolling that back. And they're like, okay, we no longer need to keep the customers in the dark about compromise of their data. And if you think about it, it's like what T-Mobile, they seem to get breached every 6 months. They're going to have to be doing some of this stuff, right? And it's applicable when an incident's affecting 500 or more customers, right? Or there's a risk of customer harm, which is another one of those vacuous definitions, right? What does it mean, customer harm? How do you know the person's going to be harmed because of this breach? If you think of the 23andMe, right? Ancestry.com type, DNA data. that was a fascinating lack of MFA. And, they're being called out, for being bad stewards of very sensitive information, right? Because this could include, genetic defects. This could include targeted attacks against Ashkenazi Jews. There's all sorts of scenarios emerging from what does it mean for customer harm. Now, of course, you're not registering with your telco, your ethnic heritage or anything, but there is an interesting ambiguity there, I think, around customer harm, which says that, if you have 499 records, you can still qualify because of this whole customer harm element. And then, of course, it introduced a new annual summary reporting requirement for breaches affecting fewer than 500 customers. So they're not leaving the big breach category off the table. They're just saying every year you have to do some type of aggregate metrics on those, because you could have 1,000 of these sub 500 events if you decide to categorize them that way. And so they want to catch that as well. But so anyway, I can't believe that their notification rules were so well written that they didn't have to update them in 16 years when the first iPhone came out. And the term breach now includes inadvertent access, use, or disclosure. So let's say that someone sends an email and they attach a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet includes 500, 600 rows of customer data, and they send it to the wrong Jane Smith, right? This happens a lot, actually. People have auto completion on emails. They hit send and they're oops, and it's a data leak, right? It goes to an unauthorized Jane Smith, not the one that you meant. That is now considered a breach. In legal terms, general counsel love to invent new terms like data spillage or data leak. It feels like you're carrying a cup of water and you have to spill a little bit of it. Data breach, though, has very strong legal requirements for disclosure and reporting. And so I think what this does, it ups the bar and says you can't get around it by just defining these things, on your own and say, oh, this is a data spillage because someone sent an email somewhere. Nope. The FCC now says that's a breach. Additional stuff about FCC. They did attempt to include updated protections for broadband internet access providers back in 2016. But Congress, in their infinite wisdom, you've heard the joke, if what's the opposite of progress, right? It's Congress, right? But anyway, pros and cons. That's a joke about Congress not being terribly functional body, which I don't think it is these days either. But it was nullified by Congress, right? So broadband, this is the whole death of net neutrality, right? And so they currently are exempt. But I'm guessing that those rules that were revoked in 2017 are going to come back on the ballot, come back onto the docket, come back onto the FCC. So they introduced on October 19th rules and proposed rulemaking to reestablish authority over those broadband providers. So right now there's an exception. Note, of course, the FCC and the SEC rules are both being challenged along party lines. So the possibility of one or more back and forth on them is pretty high. At least the table of contents shows, in one of these documents that there are legal challenges. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out, for example, against the SEC rules and said, no, this is onerous. You can't do this to us. You're not allowed to define cybersecurity details and publish and be proscriptive in that area. So we'll see what happens, whether or not these books, these laws stay on the books for very long. With the FCC updates, breach notifications have to include provider's address and contact, description of the incident, customer information that was used, disclosed, or accessed, the method of compromise. So, I don't know, credential stuffing, right? Or brute force, or other types of, social engineering. The date range of the incident, approximate number of customers, estimated financial loss. Again, pretty online with what we're seeing elsewhere. So FCC is now on board for this as well. All right, so the last one before we can do a little Q&A. Dora. So I was joking, I put up a post, it's actually in my next slide, right? Dora the Explorer. Soy yo, Dora, here comes the new regulations. But anyway, let me jump back to previous slide. The Digital Operational Resilience Act. So let's say that you're under the jurisdiction of all of these, right? So you are a publicly traded company, you operate in the financial services sector out of New York, and you're a globally going concern. That means DORA is interesting for you as well. So European financial institutions have to follow these rules, and they're ICT providers. So ICT is a 3-letter acronym that they use in Europe for IT in the US. When I moved to Europe, I was like going on Monster Board looking for jobs, and I was looking for IT, directors and IT positions, and I found nothing because they have their own language for things. They call it, ICT, and it's kind of like the UN when they talk about informatics, right? Informatics, what do you mean? It's called information technology. So you have to always be aware of geographical differentiations, but basically you have to have detection, containment, repair capabilities against the third-party IT providers, but given that Europe likes to move slow and be, accommodating to slow moving, entities that they regulate, the DORA requirements, you don't have to comply with them until January 17th, 2025. So like, it's like the French, let's break for lunch. I'll see you in another 3 hours, and so it's kind of like this sort of, European way to do regulation, but they do, GDPR is pretty advanced. The CCPA in California, the California Consumer Protection Act, is, a state level copy of some of the things that the GDPR introduced, for data privacy and right, for data subjects to know what kind of data you have on them, things like that. So I have a couple of links to the DORA details, but the next and last slide on this was, it allows for what they call lead overseers to levy fines amounting to 1% of their daily worldwide turnover for the previous year. And providers can be fined every day for up to 6 months. I don't know what happens after 6 months. They just stop fining you. You can just sort of outlast them. I imagine they step it up and do something worse, like take away your license to do business or something. But as lead overseers, there's 3 entities, EBA, IOPA, and ESMA, and they have the power to monitor on a pan-European scale the activity of all of the folks that are involved in the context of IT services to financial entities in Europe. The image credit here is a generative AI website, again, playgroundai.com. I've lost a lot of time having fun there making images, including the background image behind me. I said, Dora the Explorer cartoon character holding the scales of justice in front of the EU Parliament buildings with many European flags encircling the scene. So it didn't really fulfill my request, but it gave me a fun visual. And here we are. We are now at the questions section. And before we jump into the questions, here is your chance to take a picture of the screen. It opens up a mail to tag, so it's not malware. And it just simply composes an email to me saying, hey, I'd like a copy of these slides. So I'll pause here for a second if you want to request a copy with all of the hyperlinks and continued detailed reading. But it's 12:47 according to my clock. I think I did pretty good on timing. Feel free to reach out and ask for a copy of the slides or follow up on some of the themes and discussion topics. But at this point, I'll stop the share and open it up to our group of 23. Anyone have a question, observation, want to say thanks, want to put a $5 tip jar Patreon donation, or of course, sign up for a talk with myself and Milan to see how we can help you with this area. So questions, thoughts, feedback.
Hey, Mike, Andy.
Hey, Andy.
As always, great overview and updates on some of the things I've been tracking. I had to step out a little bit. I don't know if was this recorded?
Yes.
Okay,
and
awesome.
So you can always watch the playback later.
Okay, awesome. One of the things I was wondering about is the medical device world and FDA new responsibilities, authorities. Did you had mentioned that by chance?
No, I didn't. And I'm remiss but then again, it deserves its own whole session. So yeah. I'll take that up as a second piece, because there are definitely new changes. The governor of New York has actually put some money into an effort to raise the bar, because medical institutions, hospitals, and other providers, they've been targeted unlike anything they have in the past. There used to be sort of a gentleman's agreement among thieves that you wouldn't hit schools, you wouldn't hit critical infrastructure, and you wouldn't hit hospitals. Well, that's out the window. They've been hit a lot lately. Yeah. Matt, I know you can talk to this, but let me ask Phil's comment real quick before we get to you.
Oh, yeah. No, mostly just wanted to say thanks, Mike, for the overview. It was comprehensive as expected, but always pleasantly appreciative of how you cover everything. I made a comment about this earlier, and I think you cited it, but I am intrigued to see whether the SEC, who technically has jurisdiction over any organization that takes any
That's
kind of investment,
millions. That's
over
millions of
it's I don't know if they're ever really going to capitalize on that, or I suppose pun not intended with that word, on going in that kind of a direction, but it could impact even more of us more extensively. Anyway,
Sure.
overall,
It,
really appreciate the coverage here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it may the FTC's updates may actually deserve
Right.
pole position on your list of worries.
Yeah, no, and that's part of what I learned based on your coverage here, and and yeah, I suppose the timing really did slip under the radar because of all of our at least I don't know about everybody
focus
else
on
here,
the
but
SEC.
yeah, most of the people that I talked to are we're all in a huffy about the SEC stuff, but I'm going to start paying attention to FTC going forward. So thank you, Mike.
Yeah, and I think the SEC has like got an interim staffing up of like 30 people to do investigations. And unless the FTC decides to hire like 200 or 300 people to do investigations, they're not going to have the capability to enforce. And so it's just going to be, oh, we just updated the paperwork, but we have no capability to put teeth into that policy. So that remains to be seen. But it's interesting, like I said, to see the job positions and postings. You can track that. You can go to the FTC and see how many career positions they have open for, incident response and analysts, things like that. But thanks, Phil. I appreciate your kind words. Nitin, thank you for joining. What's your thought?
Yeah, no, I think this was really great, and echo the comments made by the other people on the call, Andrew and Philip as well. I think the point I wanted to make, and it's not a question, it's more of a comment, is while we work with the new regulations, it's important to include the folks that are from ERM, from legal, compliance, all in this conversation. So like, obviously we are a publicly traded firm. We are working on our 10K filing as we speak, and we are working with our lawyers and corporate secretaries. So that was the point I wanted to make, is educate people alongside is so important. Like, while we know things or we are learning, I think working with them is so crucial and important. And it's a team sport. We can't do this alone. And that's the point I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, thank you. ThoughtWorks, you guys are a global organization, so you fall under all of these jurisdictional changes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we did a webinar recently on this, and so
Yes.
I'm glad to see you join my independent discussion on it as well. And it's interesting to think about. Yeah, we need to partner with legal on this and HR, right? Because a lot of your incidents that are going to be disclosed are going to be insiders. Intentional or unintentional. And if you don't have an insider risk program, you're not in a position to actually detect this stuff until it shows up on the dark web. And then, the social media and the trade publications are calling up and say, so do you have a comment for us about your breach? And if you're sitting there saying, what breach? That's not going to be a good position. The street will write a really bad narrative about your incident response if you don't even know that it happened until, media coverage comes knocking on your door. Let me call out Ahmad. Ahmad, great to see you on the call. Ahmad and I used to work together at Marvel. It used to be both of our jobs, keep Iron Man safe. Ahmad, any thoughts or feedback? Yeah, nice to see you too.
Oh, for the great presentation. Oh,
thanks.
We are in the middle of we're doing currently NYDFS audit. So.
And is that going well, or is it painful? It's like a digital colonoscopy, and they're asking you to turn your head and cough.
Yeah, the later one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's the point, I guess. Yeah. Regulatory is stepping up, and they're going to start doing more investigations. And if you don't have a good paper trail of change control, pen tests, remediation, you're gonna get fined. I know there was a couple of healthcare incidents recently. The very first one, speaking to the question about like what is the risk. What is it called? The Office of Civil Rights, OCR, is the one that actually levied the first filing against a phishing attack of a healthcare provider. I think it was called Health EC or something. No, it was called LaForge. And so it's listed on their website, $480,000, and they're living under a microscope for the next 2 years. And if they violate any of the provisions of this agreement, it's going to be millions of dollars worth of fines and not just 480,000. Now, if this company was operating with a $200,000 InfoSec budget, I wonder what their budget's going to look like now. They have to comply with all of these best practices that they weren't complying with that led to this breach. And it was a phishing attack that got access to an email, and there was PHI in that user's email. Now, number one, it's really smart to not put PHI in email because that is just an easy attack vector. Lots of breaches happen with social media and compromise and phishing, and so you got to make sure you use tools like Virtru and other tools that do encryption of email and multi-factor auth to retrieve it, so that even if your email account does get breached, you're not disclosing all the sensitive information that's in your inbox, or at least you should be encrypting those emails using a tool. And I have no financial relationship in full disclosure with Virtru, but I do love their product. They use something called TDF, Transport Data Format, or no, Trusted Data Format. It was invented by the NSA. So it's pretty cool. And it allows you to do this kind of envelope around emails and encrypt, the contents. But thanks, Aman, for joining. Great to hear from you. And condolences on your audit. But your organization should become better because of it, right? The gaps, I don't mind putting gaps on my SOC 2 when I work at a company. Why? Because it's an intentional feedback loop that's supposed to be there, which is, hey, you say this in your policy, but you don't do it. And so that's teeth, right? For me, for some of these companies, they're not regulated. And so I need the auditor to come in and say, hey, you didn't do a background check on all of your contractors because they did a sample and some of them came back and say, we don't have it. And so that's a good feedback loop for me to go to the HR team and say, how can I help you automate background checks? How can I put you on Veti or Checker or something like that automatically integrates with my security compliance automation tools so that it's even easier for HR to comply because it's now automated background checks. And we now remediate this gap that was identified in the audit. So at some point you want to get to the point where you embrace audit and oversight because you're doing a good job and you are protecting your investors, you're protecting your shareholders, you're protecting your employees, and most importantly, you're protecting your customers and the data of your customers. So any other questions? Kapil, nice to see you as well. We were supposed to present on a session in Ottawa, but you had a visa problem. Hopefully we can reprise that again, because I love working with the Canadians. They're our neighbors to the north. They've got well-educated, smart people, and they're the number 4 attack target for ransomware on planet Earth. So they're getting beaten up pretty bad. But how are you doing? Any thoughts or feedback to share with everyone?
Absolutely, Mike. This is a good coverage about the regulations, and yeah, this time definitely it's in October again. The session and everything. So definitely we'll look forward to work with you on this again. But yeah, the regulations and all the things are definitely been changing. A lot of things being adding over on top of the for every CISO and things kind of been 2024 looks like to be a more I would
more
say
the same.
yes.
Maybe
So
10x more of the same though. Yeah.
well, yes. So yeah, and hopefully this year we'll see a few more updates to the SECs and disclosures.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Anyone else want to, or Juan, did you want to use the last 2 minutes here to ask everyone questions?
Yeah, actually, I was reading the meeting chat area, and I saw a comment from Phil about SEC jurisdiction over US entities. And it made me think about some of the customers that we're talking to, like venture capital firms. They obviously get funding from, university endowments and others, and they fund private companies that are startups. So they are not under the NYDFS regulatory system, but sounds like from that comment that we should let them know that they need to be compliant to some degree. So Phil, if I could ask you, how do we let them know that they actually are potentially under the SEC jurisdiction?
Yeah, one, as you all probably have a sense too, because anyway, like not being necessarily inside the SEC, just like none of the rest of you are either. Who knows what's in their minds as to whether that is on their radar screen of something they're going to kind of expand to. And I would hate for you all to start talking to folks and say, "Oh, look around the corner, we have a census is coming," because none of us really know. But it might be good, like just to inject, because mostly the reason why I put that kind of comment in this gathering as well as others is because I didn't know. When a colleague told me a month or two ago when we were talking about this stuff, he's like, "Hey, Phil, you know the SEC can technically go after privately held companies too if they want to." And I was like, "Whoa, what are you talking about?" So it's more of an awareness thing that I think is valuable for you. So as you're talking to others, I would hate to recommend that you scare them or something. It would be FUD at this point,
Right.
but they may not realize it. They may not know, even though technically they're supposed to know that. So
Yeah, and they're a big fish. I mean, if you think about private equity or VCs that manage $2, $3, $4 billion,
precisely,
you know, that's
precisely.
significant, right? So they may not be
If
regulated.
the SEC goes after anybody, it's going to
Yeah.
be somebody like that, right?
Yeah, and they may not even know.
Yeah,
So
if they want to make
thanks
an
for pointing that
example.
out.
Yeah, if they want to make an example out of them. So
It's not like, I mean, sorry, but I mean, it's not like SolarWinds even knew, right? Because this is retroactive. I mean, the SEC is going after Tim and SolarWinds for fraud, which is not. I mean, that was on the books before.
the
But this
Wells
whole
notice
disclosure
was
stuff-
intent
yeah,
to
of
investigate,
course,
but then they actually
exactly.
brought the complaint. Yeah.
Exactly. But all of the stuff we're talking about now in terms of disclosure and things, you know, that was they're going after SolarWinds in a lot of ways to make an example. So anyway, yeah.
No, that just basically means that like 2 years from now, your butt might be in a sling or in a vice or whatever. So.
And Mike, one last takeaway I took from this is that we need to do a webinar on not just financial services, but also on the health
medical sector and IoT.
Right?
Yeah.
And then maybe something on the public sector, I don't know, municipalities and states, what kind of regulations they have. It's an idea for a future webinar.
Yeah, especially if you're a provider to one of those regulated entities, because third-party risk is in scope for SEC.
Yeah, Mike, I think you know, I mean, I've done a lot of work in the health sector, and I'm on the Health Sector Coordinating Council, so if I can help you there, because you are excellent at conveying the message, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Yeah, maybe we can bring you on and we can do it together.
That's good.
To bring me too.
Sure. Shoot me an email and say, "Hey, I'd like to be a part of the next TSA webinar when you talk about medical sector." I'll bring you on. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. In respect of your time, we will stop. It is now 1:01 p.m. according to my clock. And so I'll stop the recording, but thank you all for your attention. And if you're watching the recording, reach out and connect with us and talk about, this topic, your awareness of it, and whether or not you would like some help, because that's why we're here.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.